See that today with Jesus shedding his blood and showing us that that covenant was a blood covenant and lifelong. The last thing is it involves a name change. The weaker has come under the protection of the stronger. It shows that when we make a covenant, in general, the stronger party will be the protector or the guarantee of the weaker party. If you look at back in kind of medieval times, and they would have these regional kings, when a king would go to another country and conquer that country would come under the flag of the king. And so if you're going to mess with that country, you are really messing with the king and all of his territories. And that's the picture that we have in a marriage, is that when there's marriage, two become one, and that unit becomes stronger. Physically, that would typically be the man in things like physical protection and in our society. But when it relates to a biblical covenant with God, then when we're in a covenant with God, we're under his protection. And it's like, if you mess with me, you're messing with God. And that's the idea behind the biblical protection. It also signifies death of the old and birth of the new. When you were conquered by another country, you changed all your flags, you changed all your currency. Everything had to change to that new covenant that you're under. And so, we symbolize that today in our marriages. When you leave both your old houses or wherever you were living, you come into a new house, and you start that new life of being married. Mm-hmm.
What was the last part of number 5?
Number 5, an expression of enacting authority and aspect of covenant itself.
And how about number 6?
Number 6, each participant swears to God to be faithful. Anybody else missing any? Hopefully I'm not going through too fast for everybody. So in light of the biblical context of covenants, how does that apply to our marriage today? I kind of gave a few examples, but here's some that may be more specific to how a marriage models this covenant relationship. So the first is the relationship we see between Adam and Eve as the image of the Godhead. Marriage was a representation of the Trinity. We've seen that in Scripture, that 3 cords are not easily broken, talking about man, woman, and God forming a cord of 3. It was also the first time that gender was mentioned in the Bible. In Genesis, it said God made man. That term refers to mankind. And then it specifically breaks out male and female. And so up until then, God had just created the animals. There was no specific reference to any gender role or gender identity. But God created us with a gender, and that's part of his definition for marriage. It is not good for Adam to be alone, involving a relationship. So early in Genesis, that first covenant, God recognized that there needed to be a relationship between Adam and Eve that was different than Adam and all the animals. The animals were intended to be subdued and conquered by man, but that's different when he created Eve. That they were created for a relationship. On the second, number 2 there, the first marriage involved divine election. Adam didn't get to pick Eve. God created her for him. It wasn't like Adam had any choice. God put him into a deep sleep, took one of his ribs and created the woman. And so it was God's choice to create this relationship in the manner that he did with creating Adam and Eve. It was not naturally occurring. In every other instance, God created the plants, the animals, from the earth. Even Adam was created from the ground, but Eve was different. She was taken a rib from Adam and created the woman. And so this was not a natural occurrence. Even in God's creative scheme of all these new plants and animals, God chose to make her unique and make the woman different than he created, differently from any of the other animals, because he had a special intended purpose. On C, he specifically created them to complete each other. Adam was alone, and there was nothing that he could relate to in an intellectual sense. I'm sure he talked to the animals, and who knows if there was some form of communication between them at that time, but evidently it wasn't satisfying Adam in his need for relating to someone. And so God created them to complement each other and to become a single unit that would make them holy. On number 3, there are 3 obligations in marriage that God established with Adam and Eve. The first was to be fruitful and multiply. So that was to have children and to populate the earth. The second one there is to rule the earth. God created it for man to use. And C, Adam was to protect, provide, and to lead. And Eve was to be his helpmeet, his helper, and to complement him in their relationship. On number 4, it was validated by an oath. In Genesis 1:23, the man said, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh." So Adam recognized that this was something that came out of him, and he made an oath to God that this is directly out of my body. On number 5, it was a sign or a symbol. The symbol of the rib being removed from the man and placed in the woman. I guess I'd mentioned that before, that this was different. And God wanted to show the deep connection between the husband and wife, or the man and the woman. And so he used part of the man's rib in order to create the woman. On number 6, it was dependent upon God's authority. Matthew 19:6 says, "What God has joined together, let man not separate." What God has established as his covenant relationship, we are not to just arbitrarily break that covenant. God has joined it. We are commanded that man not separate. On number 7, it's lifelong. There again, Matthew 19:6 and Mark 10:9 says that man is not to separate that covenant. It is to be lifelong. On B, we are to leave father and mother and be united to his wife. They will become one flesh, in Genesis 2:24. Once that one flesh, that you kind of get that symbol of 2 people coming together to become one flesh, the only way to get them separated is by some form of tearing it apart. And that involves pain, and that involves some form of that God doesn't intend for us to have. Once we're joined together to become one flesh, that is intended to be lifelong. And it involves a name change. Just the state of being married, we used to call people single. Now they're married. We have a whole nother word that we describe 2 people that came together. Traditionally, the wife's last name changes to where they would take on that new identity, that new name that was given in marriage. And again, God views that couple as one flesh. When he sees that marriage relationship, he sees that one unit. So, okay, so here's some kind of questions, and I've kind of structured it to where we can kind of have a little more interaction at this point when we're talking about the marriages themselves. So when we look at what is the definition of a marriage, I'll give a couple of them that I kind of have written down here, but I'll see what you guys think. So what is marriage? A lifelong union based on love and loyalty. It is a covenant and not a contract. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what are the differences between a covenant and a contract. We kind of studied what a biblical covenant is. And just, I want to get your thoughts on kind of why we shouldn't look at, or God doesn't look at a marriage as a contract. A couple things I have here, and then I'll see what you guys think. It is a lifelong union growing in love to achieve a quality relationship. And if you think about it, if you have a notion of a contract, a lot of times it's not in your best interest to think of a real long term, a lifelong commitment, but in growing that relationship. If it's a contract, it might be easier to just break it and try and start over again, right? If something just doesn't work right, if you think of a contract with your cell phone company, you got a 2-year contract, but at the end of that 2 years, if it ain't working out for me, I'm going to break it and I'm going to go to a new company, right? And that idea or thought of contracts being a fixed duration, something that is serviceable, that's just not going to work in a marriage relationship. On the B part it is a union between equals with different roles. 1 Peter 3:7. When you're in a marriage, you're equals as part of the marriage, but you serve different roles. And that's different than a contract. In a contract, one person brings a specific skill or task, or maybe it's money, and the other one agrees to do something as part of that contract. And what that does is that pits you against each other to try and get your advantage in a contract. You always want the lowest price when you go shopping, and Target always wants to get the highest price for their product, right? So there's this competing contract, and a marriage is different. A covenant is your equals, and so when my wife suffers, I suffer. When she has some joy in her life, that is my joy in my life. And so the concept of a covenant is really just the opposite of a contract, because there's not that built-in competition, and God treats us as equals. Now, that's not to say we do different things. I mean, there may be one person who works, the other stays at home. They're equal, but they have much different roles within the family. Why a marriage is not a contract is contracts are much easier to renegotiate than what a covenant should be. I was thinking about the whole sports scene where athletes will get 5 years into a 7-year contract, and they happen to be the best player, and they then go strong arm and say, I want to renegotiate, and even before the term of the contract's over, because they have such a leverage over the team or whatever. And if that was presented in marriage, where one person ended up having some form of leverage, that just wouldn't work. You would not be able to have the desired relationship God wants us to have within our marriage if that was the case. And then they depend upon performance, and non-performance voids the contract. There's going to be times where my spouse just disappoints me. It's just the way humans interact, right? And if that non-performance was grounds for breaking the contract, then it'd be difficult for any marriage to survive. And so the covenant is a much different mechanism that God has in place because it doesn't depend upon performance. When I agree to marry Tanya and we're in this marriage relationship, there's going to be days where she has a bad day, and I get disappointed, my feelings are hurt, and that does not change the marriage covenant at all. It just means we have an extra thing to work on or something to overcome within the marriage. And so with that thinking, that's part of the marriage covenant versus, okay, I made a contract with you, and until I'm unhappy, and I'm just going to move on to the next one. So is there anything else that you guys can think of kind of differences or of how a marriage is more a